The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert landscape as Sarah Mitchell stepped down from the stagecoach. Dust swirled around her long blue dress as she gathered her belongings. Fort Apache stretched before her, a collection of wooden buildings surrounded by high walls that promised safety in this wild territory. She had traveled for weeks from Boston to reach this remote outpost, carrying with her the promise of marriage to Captain William Hayes, a man she had never met but who had written her beautiful letters for over a year. Sarah clutched the leather satchel containing those precious letters. William had painted pictures with his words of a life filled with adventure and purpose on the frontier. He wrote of protecting settlers and bringing civilization to the untamed lands. His photograph showed a handsome man with kind eyes and a strong jaw. At 23, Sarah had grown tired of the stuffy social circles of Boston society. When her father suggested the correspondence with the Army captain, she had embraced the opportunity for a new beginning. The fort buzzed with activity. Soldiers marched in formation across the dusty parade ground, while others tended to horses and equipment. Women in simple dresses hung laundry on lines stretched between buildings. Children played near the wooden sidewalks, their laughter mixing with the sounds of hammering and shouting orders. Sarah felt both excitement and nervousness as she looked around for Captain Hayes. A tall soldier with sergeant stripes approached her. "Miss Mitchell, I presume?" he said, touching his hat respectfully. "I'm Sergeant Thompson. Captain Hayes sends his regrets, but he's been called away on patrol. He should return within the week. In the meantime, Mrs. Henderson will see to your accommodations." Sarah felt disappointment wash over her, but she managed to smile. "Of course. I understand duty comes first." Mrs. Henderson proved to be a kind woman in her 50s who ran the boarding house within the fort. She showed Sarah to a small but clean room with a window overlooking the desert hills. "Don't you worry, dear," she said warmly. "Captain Hayes is a good man. He'll make you a fine husband. In the meantime, you can help me with the other ladies. We always have plenty to keep us busy." Over the next few days, Sarah settled into the rhythm of fort life. She helped with cooking, mending, and caring for the children. The other military wives welcomed her kindly, sharing stories of their own arrivals and adjustments to frontier life. Yet something felt different than what she had expected. The women spoke of Captain Hayes with respect but a certain distance. When she asked about him, they would smile politely and change the subject. On her 4th day at the fort, Sarah decided to explore beyond the main buildings. She walked along the perimeter wall, enjoying the fresh air and vast sky. The landscape was beautiful in its harsh way, with red rocks and scattered desert plants stretching to distant mountains. As she rounded a corner near the stables, she heard voices speaking in a language she didn't recognize. Curious, she peered around the building and saw several Apache men talking with a fort interpreter. One man in particular caught her attention. He stood taller than the others with long black hair and strong features. He wore traditional Apache clothing mixed with some pieces of white man's clothing. There was something commanding about his presence, the way the others deferred to him. As if sensing her gaze, the man looked directly at her. Their eyes met across the distance, and Sarah felt an unexpected jolt of connection. His dark eyes seemed to see right through her, past the proper Boston lady facade to something deeper. She quickly looked away, embarrassed at being caught staring, but the image of his face remained burned in her memory. That evening at dinner, Sarah asked Mrs. Henderson about the Apache visitors. "Oh, those are peaceful Apache," the older woman explained. "They come to trade and sometimes to talk with the commanding officer. That tall one you probably saw is called Running Wolf. He's some kind of leader among his people. Speaks English better than most, too. The Army tries to maintain good relations with the peaceful tribes." Sarah found herself thinking about Running Wolf as she lay in bed that night. There had been something in his gaze that stirred feelings she had never experienced before. She tried to push such thoughts away, reminding herself of her purpose here and her commitment to Captain Hayes, but sleep was slow to come. The next morning brought news that the patrol would return that afternoon. Sarah spent extra time preparing herself, choosing her best dress and arranging her blonde hair carefully. She wanted to make a good impression on her intended husband. The other women bustled about preparing a special dinner to welcome the soldiers home. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself growing increasingly nervous. She paced in her room, then walked outside to watch for signs of the returning patrol. Near the main gate, she noticed Running Wolf again. He seemed to be waiting for something as well, standing apart from the usual fort activity. When their eyes met this time, he didn't look away. Instead, he walked slowly toward her. Sarah knew she should return to her room, that it wasn't proper for her to speak with him alone, but something kept her feet planted firmly on the ground. "You are the woman who came to marry the soldier captain," he said when he reached her. His English was clear and precise, with only a slight accent. "Yes," Sarah replied, surprised by the directness of his statement. "I am Sarah Mitchell. I am called Running Wolf." He studied her face carefully. "You do not look happy for a woman about to be married." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I am quite content with my circumstances, thank you." "Content," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "That is not the same as happy." Before Sarah could respond, the sound of approaching horses filled the air. The patrol was returning. She could see Captain Hayes riding at the front of the column, his uniform dusty from travel. This was the moment she had traveled across the country for, yet she found herself reluctant to leave Running Wolf's presence. "Your soldier comes," Running Wolf observed, his expression unreadable. Sarah smoothed her dress and prepared to meet her future husband. But Running Wolf's words echoed in her mind. Content was indeed different from happy, and as she watched Captain Hayes dismount and stride toward her with a confident smile, she wondered if she would ever know the difference. Captain William Hayes strode across the fort grounds with the confidence of a man accustomed to command. His uniform was travel-worn but still sharp, and his blonde hair was neatly combed despite the long patrol. Sarah watched him approach, comparing his appearance to the photograph he had sent. He was indeed handsome, though perhaps not quite as tall as she had imagined, and there was a hardness around his eyes that hadn't shown in his letters. "Miss Mitchell," he said formally, removing his hat as he reached her. "Welcome to Fort Apache. I apologize for not being here to greet you personally upon your arrival." "Captain Hayes," Sarah replied with a curtsy, "I understand completely. Duty must always come first." He smiled at this, though the expression didn't quite reach his eyes. "Precisely. I'm pleased you understand the nature of military life. Shall we take a walk? I'd like to discuss our arrangements." Sarah nodded, acutely aware that Running Wolf still stood nearby, watching their interaction. She forced herself not to look in his direction as she took the captain's offered arm. They walked toward the center of the fort, past the flagpole where the American flag snapped in the desert breeze. "I trust Mrs. Henderson has made you comfortable," Captain Hayes said as they strolled. "She's an excellent woman, very proper. Important to maintain standards out here, you understand? Too easy for people to become uncivilized in this wilderness." "Yes, she's been very kind," Sarah agreed, though something in his tone made her uncomfortable. There was a dismissive quality when he spoke of the frontier that contrasted sharply with the appreciation for the land's beauty that had come through in his letters. "I've arranged for us to be married in 3 days," he continued briskly. "The chaplain will perform the ceremony and we'll have a small reception afterward. Nothing too elaborate, of course. Military life doesn't allow for frivolous celebrations." Sarah felt a flutter of panic. 3 days seemed terribly soon, though she couldn't quite explain why. "That's very efficient," she managed. "I believe in decisive action," Captain Hayes replied. "Hesitation leads to complications. Speaking of which, I should mention some rules about fort life that will be important for you to understand as my wife." They had stopped near the officers' quarters, a row of slightly larger buildings than the enlisted men's housing. Captain Hayes turned to face her directly, his expression serious. "First, you'll need to be very careful about your associations here. Not everyone can be trusted, particularly the local inhabitants. The Apache may seem peaceful, but they're still savages at heart. I've seen too many good people fall victim to misplaced trust." Sarah's stomach tightened. "Surely some of them are genuinely peaceful?" "A dangerous assumption," he said sharply. "They're all the same underneath, Miss Mitchell. Primitive, unreliable, and ultimately hostile to our way of life. I won't have my wife fraternizing with them under any circumstances." The harsh certainty in his voice shocked Sarah. This wasn't the thoughtful, open-minded man who had written to her about understanding different cultures and building bridges between peoples. "But in your letters you spoke of appreciation for the native peoples and their knowledge of the land." Captain Hayes frowned. "Did I? Perhaps I was being overly diplomatic. One learns to adjust one's views after sufficient experience. The reality of frontier life has a way of clarifying things." Sarah felt something cold settle in her chest. Either the man who had written those letters was very different from the one standing before her, or he had deliberately misrepresented himself. Neither possibility was comforting. "I should return to help Mrs. Henderson with dinner preparations," she said, needing to escape his presence. "Of course, but remember what I've said about associations. I'll be watching to ensure you adjust properly to your new life here." The implied threat in his words made Sarah's skin crawl, but she managed to nod politely before hurrying away. As she walked back toward the boarding house, she noticed Running Wolf was no longer where she had left him. The absence of his steady presence made her feel oddly bereft. That evening at dinner, Sarah found herself studying the other military wives more carefully. They were pleasant enough, but she noticed a certain guardedness in their interactions with their husbands. The men dominated the conversation, speaking of patrols and strategy while the women listened quietly, occasionally offering appropriate comments when addressed directly. Mrs. Henderson sat beside Sarah and seemed to sense her unease. "Adjustment takes time, dear," she whispered during a lull in conversation. "Military marriages are different from civilian ones. The men carry heavy responsibilities." "Was your husband in the army?" Sarah asked quietly. "For 30 years, Mrs. Henderson replied. "I learned early that a soldier's wife must be strong but flexible, like a willow tree in the wind." Sarah pondered this advice as she prepared for bed that night. Through her window, she could see lights flickering in the Apache camp beyond the fort walls. She wondered about Running Wolf and his people, about their lives and beliefs. Captain Hayes had dismissed them as savages, but Running Wolf had spoken with intelligence and insight. His question about her happiness had shown a perceptiveness that her intended husband seemed to lack entirely. The next morning brought an unexpected encounter. Sarah had risen early to help with breakfast preparations and decided to fetch water from the well near the fort's edge. The sun was just painting the sky pink and gold, and the air was cool and fresh. As she approached the well, she saw Running Wolf sitting on a nearby rock, apparently watching the sunrise. "Good morning," he said without turning around. "Good morning," Sarah replied, surprised he had known she was there. "You rise early." "My people believe the dawn brings wisdom," he said, finally looking at her. "What brings you out so early, woman who will marry the soldier captain?" Sarah drew water from the well, using the time to consider her answer. "I couldn't sleep. Too many thoughts crowding my mind." "Second thoughts?" he asked perceptively. "It's not proper for me to discuss such things with someone I barely know." Running Wolf stood and walked closer, though he maintained a respectful distance. "Among my people, it is believed that sometimes strangers can see truths that those close to us cannot. We are not blinded by expectations or obligations." Sarah found herself drawn to his calm presence. There was something deeply peaceful about him, yet she sensed great strength beneath the surface. "What truth do you see in me?" "I see a woman whose spirit is like a caged bird, beautiful but not meant for captivity." His words hit her with unexpected force. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, though she couldn't explain why. "I chose this life. I came here willingly." "Choosing a cage is still choosing captivity," Running Wolf said gently. "But perhaps you did not know it was a cage when you chose it." Sarah heard voices approaching and knew she needed to return before someone saw them talking. "I should go." "Wait," Running Wolf said urgently. He reached into a pouch at his side and pulled out a small carved wooden bird, a gift for the woman with the cage spirit. Sarah hesitated, knowing she shouldn't accept gifts from him, but something compelled her to take the carving. It was beautiful, depicting a bird in flight with wings spread wide. The craftsmanship was exquisite, showing patience and skill. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Thank you." "Remember," Running Wolf said as she turned to leave, "even caged birds can learn to fly again if they find the courage to open the door." Sarah hurried back to the boarding house, the wooden bird hidden in her apron pocket. Captain Hayes was waiting in the main room, his expression thunderous. "Where have you been?" he demanded. "Mrs. Henderson said you went for water, but that was over an hour ago." I got distracted watching the sunrise," Sarah stammered, hating herself for the half-truth. "We'll need to work on your sense of time and priorities," he said coldly. "A military wife cannot be wandering about aimlessly. There are schedules to keep and duties to perform." Sarah nodded meekly, but inside something had begun to shift. Running Wolf's gift seemed to burn against her side, a reminder that there were other ways of seeing the world, other possibilities she had never considered. The wooden bird remained hidden in Sarah's room, wrapped carefully in a handkerchief and tucked beneath her other belongings. Each time she looked at it, she felt a mixture of guilt and something else she couldn't quite name. The carving was so lifelike she almost expected it to take flight from her palm. She found herself touching it whenever Captain Hayes became particularly demanding or dismissive, drawing comfort from its smooth surface. As the day of her wedding approached, Captain Hayes became increasingly controlling about her movements and associations. He had assigned one of the enlisted men's wives, Mrs. Porter, to keep her company and ensure she stayed within appropriate areas of the fort. Mrs. Porter was a nervous woman who jumped at shadows and repeated everything the captain told her word for word. "The captain says you mustn't wander near the Apache camp," Mrs. Porter reminded her for the third time that morning, as they worked on Sarah's wedding dress. "He says they might try to steal you away or fill your head with heathen ideas." Sarah's fingers stilled on the white fabric. "Has that ever happened before? Apache stealing women from the fort?" "Well, no," Mrs. Porter admitted. "But the captain says you can never be too careful. He knows best about these things." Sarah resumed her stitching with sharp, angry movements. Everything was "the captain says this" or "the captain knows that." It seemed no one at the fort was allowed to form their own opinions about anything. Even Mrs. Henderson, who had initially seemed so kind and independent, had grown distant since Captain Hayes had spoken with her privately. That afternoon, while Mrs. Porter dozed in her chair, Sarah decided to take a walk around the fort's perimeter. She told herself she was just getting some fresh air, but deep down she hoped to see Running Wolf again. She needed to understand the feelings his presence stirred in her, to make sense of the confusion that had settled over her like a heavy blanket. She found him near the same spot where they had first talked, sitting beneath a scraggly tree that provided the only shade for yards around. He looked up as she approached, and she saw something like relief cross his features. "I was not certain you would come," he said simply. "I shouldn't be here," Sarah replied, but she sat down on a nearby rock anyway. "Tomorrow I'll be married, and this kind of friendship won't be possible anymore." Running Wolf studied her face carefully. "You do not sound like a happy bride." Sarah laughed, but it came out bitter. "I don't know what happiness feels like anymore. Everything here is so different from what I expected. The man I thought I was marrying seems to exist only in letters. Tell me about these letters," Running Wolf said gently. Sarah found herself pouring out the story of the correspondence that had brought her west. She described the thoughtful, curious man who had written to her about the beauty of the desert, the complexity of relations between different peoples, the excitement of building something new in the wilderness. As she spoke, Running Wolf listened without judgment, occasionally asking quiet questions that helped her see things more clearly. "This man in the letters," he said when she finished, "he sounds like someone worth crossing a continent to marry. But the man you have met is nothing like him," Sarah finished. "It's as if someone else wrote those letters, someone who actually cares about understanding this land and its people instead of just conquering them." Running Wolf was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes thoughtful. "Among my people, we believe that sometimes the spirits of the dead speak through the living, especially when there are important messages to be shared. Perhaps these letters carried such a message, even if the man who wrote them did not understand its true meaning." "What do you mean?" "Perhaps the spirits knew you needed to come here, but not for the reason you believed. Perhaps your true purpose is something different entirely." Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. What could that purpose be? Before Running Wolf could answer, they heard the sound of approaching horses. He stood quickly, his body tense with alertness. "Patrol returning early. You should go back to the fort now." Sarah rose reluctantly, but as she turned to leave, Running Wolf caught her arm gently. "Sarah," he said, using her name for the first time. "If you ever need help, if you ever feel unsafe, come to the Apache camp. Ask for Running Wolf. You will be protected there." The intensity in his voice made her meet his eyes. "Why would you help me? You barely know me." "Sometimes the heart knows what the mind has not yet understood," he replied. "And sometimes protecting one person protects many others as well." Sarah hurried back to the fort, her mind spinning with confusion and possibility. As she approached the main buildings, she saw Captain Hayes dismounting from his horse near the stable. His face was flushed with anger, and he was speaking harshly to his sergeant. "Search every inch of that camp," he was ordering. "I want to know what they're planning. 3 horses missing from their remuda doesn't just happen by accident." "Sir," the sergeant replied hesitantly. Our Apache scout says it's probably just young men going off on a hunt. Normal behavior for this time of year. Our Apache scout, Captain Hayes spat. That's the problem right there, Sergeant. We're trusting the word of savages about other savages. From now on, I want double guards on everything and no Apache allowed within 100 yards of the fort without my direct permission. Sarah felt her stomach drop. If Captain Hayes was restricting Apache access to the fort, she might never see Running Wolf again. The thought filled her with a desperation that surprised her with its intensity. That evening, as she sat through another tense dinner listening to Captain Hayes explain his new security measures, Sarah made a decision that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. She would not go through with the wedding. She couldn't marry a man who saw an entire people as enemies simply because they were different. She couldn't spend her life pretending to agree with views that made her soul recoil. But how could she escape? She had no money for passage back east. No family who would understand her decision to abandon such an advantageous marriage. The other military wives would never help her break her engagement to their commanding officer. She was trapped as surely as the wooden bird would be trapped if it were real. As she lay in bed that night, Sarah clutched the carved bird and tried to think of a way out. Through her window, she could see fires burning in the Apache camp. Somewhere out there, Running Wolf was probably sitting around one of those fires, and she found herself wondering what stories his people told in the darkness, what dreams they shared under the vast desert sky. The next morning dawned clear and bright, her wedding day. Sarah dressed mechanically in the white gown she had altered to fit her, but her reflection in the small mirror looked like a stranger. Her blue eyes seemed huge in her pale face, and there was something wild in them that she had never seen before. Mrs. Porter bustled around, chattering nervously about the ceremony preparations. The captain wants everything perfect, she said for the dozenth time. He's invited all the officers and their wives. It's going to be quite the event. Sarah nodded absently, but her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about Running Wolf's words about caged birds learning to fly if they found the courage to open the door. The question was whether she had that kind of courage, and what would happen if she tried to use it. As the morning progressed and the time for the ceremony drew closer, Sarah felt a strange calm settle over her. She had made her choice, though she wasn't entirely sure what that choice would lead to. All she knew was that she couldn't walk down that aisle and promise to love and honor a man who represented everything she had come to despise about rigid, narrow thinking. The wooden bird seemed to grow warm in her hands as she held it one last time before hiding it in her dress. Whatever happened next, she would face it with the same spirit that had brought her across the country in the first place. She had sought adventure and a new life, and perhaps she was about to find both, just not in the way she had expected. The wedding ceremony was set for 2 o'clock in the afternoon, time to take advantage of the cooler temperatures that came with the desert's shifting shadows. Sarah stood in her room, fully dressed in the white gown that now felt like a costume for a role she refused to play. Through her window, she could see the Apache camp in the distance. But Captain Hayes's new restrictions meant the area between the fort and the camp was now patrolled by armed soldiers. Mrs. Porter knocked on the door, her voice bright with forced cheer. Sarah, dear, it's time. The captain is waiting at the chapel. I'll be right there, Sarah called back, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. She had spent the morning in a state of strange calm, as if she were watching someone else's life unfold. Now, as the moment of truth arrived, she felt that same detached clarity. She gathered her few personal belongings into a small bundle, leaving behind the elaborate trousseau she had brought from Boston. The wooden bird went into her pocket, its familiar weight a source of comfort. At the last moment, she picked up the letters from Captain Hayes, the ones that had brought her here with their false promises and beautiful lies. She would leave those behind as well. Sarah opened her door to find Mrs. Porter waiting anxiously in the hallway. "Oh, you look beautiful," the older woman gushed. "The captain will be so pleased." "Thank you," Sarah replied, following Mrs. Porter toward the chapel. Her mind was working rapidly, calculating distances and timing. The Apache camp was perhaps a mile from the fort, across open ground that offered little cover. If she was going to reach Running Wolf's people, she would need a distraction and a head start. The chapel was packed with officers and their wives, all dressed in their finest clothes for the occasion. Captain Hayes stood at the front in his dress uniform, looking every inch the confident military commander. His smile was broad as he watched Sarah walk down the short aisle, but she noticed it still didn't reach his eyes. The chaplain, a thin man with a nervous manner, opened his prayer book and began the ceremony. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in the sight of God to unite this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Sarah let the familiar words wash over her as she studied the faces around her. The other military wives watched with expressions that mixed genuine happiness for her, with something else she was beginning to recognize as resignation. These women had all made similar choices, accepting security and status in exchange for their independence and authentic selves. If anyone knows of any reason why this man and this woman should not be joined in marriage, let them speak now or forever hold their peace, the chaplain intoned. The chapel fell silent except for the sound of breathing and the distant noise of fort activities. Sarah felt the moment stretch like a taut rope, and she realized this was her chance. In the absolute quiet, her voice rang out clear and strong. "I do." A collective gasp rose from the assembled guests. Captain Hayes's face went through several shades of red before settling on a dangerous purple. "What did you say?" he asked in a voice that could have frozen the desert. "I said I do," Sarah repeated, her courage growing with each word. "I know of a reason why we should not be married. We are completely unsuited to each other in every way that matters." The chaplain looked back and forth between them like a man watching a tennis match. "Miss Mitchell, this is highly irregular. Perhaps you're suffering from pre-wedding nerves?" "I'm suffering from a sudden attack of honesty," Sarah replied. She turned to face Captain Hayes directly. "You're not the man who wrote those letters. I don't know if you ever were, but you certainly aren't now. You're rigid, controlling, and prejudiced against people who are different from you. I will not marry you." Captain Hayes stepped closer, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper that only she could hear. "You will marry me, or you'll find yourself in a very difficult situation indeed. You have no money, no family here, and nowhere to go. You'll do as you're told." Sarah felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. This was the real man beneath the uniform and polite manners, someone who would use threats and intimidation to get his way. Her resolve hardened into steel. "No," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I will not." Before anyone could react, Sarah turned and ran from the chapel. Behind her, she heard Captain Hayes shouting orders and the sound of people scrambling to their feet. She had perhaps 30 seconds before they organized a pursuit. Sarah ran through the fort toward the main gate, her white dress billowing around her like a signal flag. The guards at the gate, confused by the sight of a bride running at full speed, hesitated just long enough for her to slip past them and out into the open desert. The ground between the fort and the Apache camp was rocky and uneven, scattered with sagebrush and small cacti that caught at her dress. Sarah could hear shouting behind her, and the sound of horses being saddled. Captain Hayes would come after her. She had no doubt about that. His pride and his authority had been challenged in front of his entire command. As she ran, Sarah tried to remember everything Running Wolf had told her about finding his camp. "Look for the smoke from their fires," he had said. "Follow the creek bed that ran along the base of the red rocks. Ask for Running Wolf by name and she would be protected." Her breath came in sharp gasps as she pushed herself harder than she had ever had to before. The wedding dress was not designed for running across desert terrain, and she could hear fabric tearing as it caught on thorny plants. Behind her, the sound of pursuing horses was getting closer. Sarah stumbled and nearly fell as her foot caught in a rabbit hole. She could see the Apache camp ahead now, smoke rising from their fires, people moving about their daily activities. But the horses behind her were gaining ground rapidly. She wouldn't make it at this pace. Just as despair began to set in, Sarah heard a different sound cutting through the noise of pursuit. It was a war cry, high and fierce, coming from somewhere ahead of her. She looked up to see Running Wolf on horseback, riding toward her at full gallop. Behind him came several other Apache warriors, their horses kicking up clouds of dust. The two groups of riders converged near where Sarah had stopped, exhausted and gasping for breath. Captain Hayes led the military pursuit, his face twisted with rage. He pulled his horse to a halt perhaps 20 feet from where Running Wolf sat his mount, and for a moment the two men stared at each other across the desert space. "That woman is my intended bride," Captain Hayes called out. "She's obviously suffered some kind of mental breakdown. I demand you return her to the fort immediately." Running Wolf's response was calm but carried an unmistakable authority. "The woman came to us of her own choice. Among my people, A woman's decisions about her own life are respected. She's not one of your people, Captain Hayes snarled. She's a white woman under my protection. She does not appear to want your protection, Running Wolf observed. He looked down at Sarah, who was standing between the two groups of men like a prize they were competing for. What do you choose, Sarah Mitchell? Sarah felt the weight of both men's attention, along with that of the assembled warriors and soldiers. This was the moment that would determine the course of her entire life. She thought about the wooden bird in her pocket, about Running Wolf's words concerning cage spirits learning to fly. I ask you earnestly, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the desert air as she looked directly at Running Wolf. I won't be claimed by them. Make me yours. Running Wolf nodded once, a gesture that seemed to seal something between them. Behind Captain Hayes, she heard the distinctive sound of an arrow being nocked and drawn. The Apache had readied his weapons. She's with me, Running Wolf declared, his voice leaving no room for argument. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Sarah realized that her simple decision to run from an unwanted marriage had suddenly become something much larger and more dangerous. The standoff between the two groups of armed men could easily explode into violence that would affect far more people than just herself. But for the first time since arriving at Fort Apache, Sarah felt truly free. Whatever happened next, she had chosen her own path instead of accepting one that others had laid out for her. The wooden bird in her pocket seemed to pulse with warmth, as if it approved of her decision to finally spread her wings and fly. The standoff stretched like a wire about to snap. Captain Hayes sat rigidly in his saddle, his hand hovering near his pistol while his eyes darted between Running Wolf and the Apache warriors who flanked him. The desert wind stirred dust around the horses' hooves, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out as if commenting on the tension below. You're making a serious mistake, Captain Hayes said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. This woman is a United States citizen. Taking her against her will is an act of war. Running Wolf's expression remained calm, but Sarah could see the steel beneath his composure. She came to us willingly. Your own ears heard her words. She's clearly not in her right mind, Captain Hayes insisted. Wedding nerves, nothing more. A temporary condition that will pass once she's back where she belongs. Sarah felt anger flare in her chest at being discussed as if she weren't present, as if her clearly stated wishes meant nothing, simply because they didn't align with what the men wanted. I am perfectly capable of making my own decisions, she said loudly, and I choose not to return to the fort. Captain Hayes turned his attention to her, his voice taking on what he probably thought was a reasonable tone. Sarah, be sensible. What kind of life do you think you'll have among these people? They're primitives, savages who live in conditions no civilized woman could endure. Come back with me now and we'll forget this unfortunate incident ever happened. Forget? Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. You want me to forget that you threatened me at the altar? That you showed your true nature when you thought you had me trapped? She shook her head firmly. I will never forget, and I will never go back. The captain's face darkened further. Then you've chosen to become a traitor to your own people. I've chosen to become true to myself, Sarah replied. Running Wolf guided his horse closer to where Sarah stood. Without a word, he reached down and offered her his hand. Sarah looked up at him, seeing not just an escape from her current situation but a doorway to a completely different way of living. She grasped his hand and he pulled her up behind him on his horse with surprising ease. This is an act of war, Captain Hayes repeated, but his voice had lost some of its conviction. He was outnumbered and his men looked nervous. They were good soldiers, but they hadn't signed up to start a conflict over one runaway bride. Running Wolf spoke with quiet authority. Tell your superiors that the woman called Sarah Mitchell has chosen to live among the Apache, under our protection. She is no longer subject to the laws of your fort or your people. Any attempt to take her by force will be met with appropriate response. The warning was clear without being overtly threatening, but Captain Hayes was too proud to back down gracefully. You haven't heard the last of this, he snarled. I'll have every cavalry unit in the territory hunting for her. Then you will have many frustrated soldiers, Running Wolf replied calmly. The desert is large and my people know every hiding place. As they spoke, Sarah felt the solid warmth of Running Wolf's back against her and the powerful movement of the horse beneath them. For the first time in weeks, she felt safe. The irony wasn't lost on her that she felt more protected, among people Captain Hayes called savages than she had among her own supposed countrymen. Captain Hayes wheeled his horse around with unnecessary violence, causing the animal to rear and prance. "Return to the fort," he barked at his men. "We'll deal with this through proper military channels." As the soldiers rode away in a cloud of dust and wounded pride, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and terror wash over her. She had just burned every bridge that connected her to her old life. There was no going back now, even if she wanted to. Running Wolf guided his horse toward the Apache camp at a leisurely pace, giving Sarah time to absorb what had just happened. Behind them, the other warriors followed at a respectful distance, their presence both protective and reassuring. "Are you afraid?" Running Wolf asked without turning around. "Terrified," Sarah admitted. "But not of you or your people. I'm afraid of what I've just done, of how completely I've changed my life in the space of a few minutes." "Fear of change is natural," Running Wolf said, "but sometimes the greatest fear comes from staying the same when everything inside you demands something different." As they approached the Apache camp, Sarah saw people emerging from their dwellings to watch their arrival. There were men, women, and children of all ages, their faces showing curiosity rather than hostility. Some wore traditional Apache clothing, while others had adopted pieces of white man's dress. The camp itself was larger than she had expected, with well-organized areas for different activities and a sense of permanent settlement, rather than the temporary gathering she had imagined. An older woman with silver streaking her long black hair stepped forward as they dismounted. She spoke rapidly to Running Wolf in Apache, her eyes never leaving Sarah's face. Sarah couldn't understand the words, but the tone seemed questioning rather than accusatory. "This is my grandmother, woman who sees far," Running Wolf explained. "She is the mother of our people here, and her wisdom guides many of our decisions. She wants to know if you understand what you have chosen." Sarah looked into the older woman's keen eyes and saw intelligence, strength, and something that might have been compassion. "Tell her that I understand I have chosen an uncertain path, but that the certain path I was leaving would have destroyed my spirit. Tell her I hope to learn from her people and perhaps, in time, contribute something of value to your community." Running Wolf translated, and Sarah heard her name mentioned several times in the conversation that followed. Finally, the old woman nodded and spoke again. "She says the spirits told her in a dream that a lost bird would come to our people seeking a new nest. She believes you are that bird, and that your arrival has meaning beyond what any of us yet understand." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected acceptance. In the world she had left behind, women were valued primarily for their ability to support their husbands and bear children. Here an elderly Apache woman was suggesting that her arrival might have spiritual significance. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. "Now you learn," Running Wolf replied. "You learn our ways, our language, our relationship with the land and each other. Some things will be difficult for you, very different from the life you knew, but you will not be forced into any role you do not choose for yourself." As the sun began to set over the desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah followed Running Wolf and his grandmother deeper into the camp. Children peeked out from behind their mothers' skirts to stare at the strange white woman in the torn wedding dress. Young men nodded respectfully to Running Wolf, while older ones watched Sarah with expressions that ranged from curiosity to mild skepticism. A small dwelling had been prepared for her, Running Wolf explained, where she could rest and begin to adjust to her new circumstances. It was simple, but clean, with woven mats on the floor and a small fire pit in the center. Sarah's few belongings looked pitifully small in the space, but the wooden bird seemed more at home here than it ever had hidden in her room at the fort. That night, as Sarah lay on the soft buffalo hide that served as her bed, she listened to the sounds of the Apache camp settling into sleep. There were quiet conversations in a language she didn't understand, the soft nickering of horses, and somewhere in the distance, someone playing a flute with a haunting, beautiful melody. She thought about the people at Fort Apache who were probably discussing her dramatic departure over their evening meal. Mrs. Henderson would be worried about her, she knew, but would probably also be relieved not to have to deal with the aftermath of such a scandalous event. The other military wives would whisper about her for weeks, probably concluding that she had been mentally unstable all along. Captain Hayes would be the most dangerous variable in her new equation. His pride had been wounded in front of his entire command, and men like him didn't forgive such humiliations easily. He would find a way to justify pursuing her, probably claiming it was his duty to rescue a deranged white woman from savage captivity. But for now, Sarah was safe in the heart of the Apache community, under the protection of a man who had risked potential conflict to honor her choice. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and the beginning of a life she couldn't yet imagine, but tonight she was free. For the first time since leaving Boston, she was exactly where she chose to be. The wooden bird sat on a small shelf Running Wolf had pointed out to her, its carved wings seeming to catch and reflect the dying firelight. It no longer looked like a symbol of captivity, but rather like a promise of the flight that was finally possible. Sarah woke to the sound of women's voices and the smell of wood smoke mixed with something that might have been cooking meat. Sunlight streamed through the entrance of her dwelling, telling her she had slept much later than usual. For a moment she felt disoriented, expecting to see the familiar walls of her room at the fort. Then memory flooded back, and with it came a mixture of relief and anxiety about what this new day would bring. She dressed quickly in the same torn wedding dress, as it was the only clothing she had. When she emerged from her shelter, she found Woman Who Sees Far waiting outside with several other Apache women. The elderly woman smiled and gestured for Sarah to follow them to what appeared to be a communal cooking area. The women ranged in age from teenagers to grandmothers, and they chattered among themselves in Apache as they worked. Despite the language barrier, Sarah could sense their curiosity about her. Some glanced at her shyly while others studied her more boldly. One young woman about her own age approached and pointed to herself, saying Ayana clearly. Then she pointed to Sarah with a questioning expression. Sarah, Sarah replied, pointing to herself. The woman repeated her name carefully, and soon several others were trying out the unfamiliar English sounds. Woman Who Sees Far handed Sarah a wooden bowl filled with what looked like a mixture of ground corn, berries, and meat. It was unlike anything she had eaten before, but hunger made her grateful for whatever was offered. To her surprise, it was quite tasty, with a nutty flavor from the corn and sweetness from the berries that balanced the rich meat. As she ate, Sarah became aware that she was the center of considerable attention. Children had gathered at a respectful distance to stare at her pale skin and light hair. Some of the older people watched her with expressions that seemed to be evaluating how well she would adapt to their way of life. Running Wolf appeared as she was finishing her meal. He had exchanged his mixed clothing from the day before for traditional Apache dress, and Sarah was struck by how naturally he wore the role of leader among his people. His presence seemed to command respect without demanding it. "How did you sleep?" he asked in English, though Sarah noticed he had been speaking Apache with everyone else. "Better than I expected," she replied honestly, "though I think today will be more challenging than yesterday." Running Wolf smiled at this. "Yesterday you only had to choose a new life. Today you have to begin living it." He explained that Woman Who Sees Far had volunteered to teach her the basics of Apache life, starting with language and customs. Ayana, the young woman who had introduced herself, would help with practical matters like finding appropriate clothing and learning to prepare food. Other women would teach her various skills as she showed interest and aptitude. "What about you?" Sarah asked. "What will you be doing?" "I have responsibilities to my people that cannot be ignored," Running Wolf said. "Hunting, trading, dealing with threats to our safety. But I will not be far away." The mention of threats made Sarah's stomach tighten. "You mean Captain Hayes, among others. Your departure from the fort has created complications that go beyond your personal situation. The captain was already looking for reasons to restrict our movements and limit our access to traditional hunting grounds. Your presence here gives him additional justification for aggressive actions." Sarah felt guilt wash over her. "I've put your people in danger by coming here. You have given us an opportunity to demonstrate that we will not be intimidated by threats," Running Wolf corrected. "The conflict was coming regardless of your choices. At least now we face it with the knowledge that we are protecting someone who deserves protection." Before Sarah could respond, a young Apache man came running into the camp, speaking rapidly and gesturing toward the fort. Running Wolf's expression grew serious as he listened, and he asked several sharp questions in return. "What is it?" Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Soldiers are coming," Running Wolf replied. "A large patrol more than yesterday. They are not riding directly toward our camp, but they are moving in a pattern that suggests they are searching for something." "For me?" Sarah said flatly. "Most likely. Captain Hayes has probably convinced his superiors that you were taken against your will, and that a rescue operation is necessary. Woman Who Sees Far had been listening to the conversation, and now she spoke urgently to Running Wolf. Sarah didn't understand the words, but the tone suggested she was giving advice or making a request. My grandmother says you should learn to shoot, Running Wolf translated. If soldiers come looking for you, you should be able to defend yourself rather than relying entirely on others for protection. Sarah had never held a gun in her life. In Boston, such things were handled by men, and proper ladies were expected to remain safely removed from anything resembling violence. But these were not the circumstances she had been raised to expect. Teach me, she said. Running Wolf nodded approvingly. We will start with a bow. Guns are loud and draw attention. A bow can kill silently when necessary. The next several hours were unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. Running Wolf taught her to string a bow and showed her the proper stance for drawing and aiming. Her first attempts were clumsy and frustrated, but gradually she began to understand the rhythm and balance required. Other Apache gathered to watch, offering encouragement and occasional suggestions. Ayana proved to be an excellent teacher in other areas. She found Sarah a simple dress made of soft doeskin that was much more practical than the ruined wedding gown. She also began teaching her essential Apache words, starting with terms for food, water, danger, and basic courtesy. As the day progressed, Sarah found herself surprised by how quickly she was adapting. The Apache way of life was indeed very different from what she was accustomed to, but it was also more practical and in many ways more honest than the rigid social structures she had left behind. People were valued for their contributions to the community, rather than their adherence to arbitrary rules of behavior. Late in the afternoon, the young man who had brought news of the soldiers returned with an update. This time, his report made Running Wolf's jaw tighten with anger. The soldiers have surrounded our camp, he told Sarah. They are not attacking, but they are preventing anyone from leaving or entering. Captain Hayes has sent word that he wants to negotiate for your return. Sarah felt her heart sink. What will you do? I will talk with him, Running Wolf replied. But not from a position of weakness. He needs to understand that you are here by choice and that we will not be intimidated into giving you up. As evening approached, Sarah could see the soldiers positioned on the hills around the Apache camp. Their presence was unmistakable, a clear show of force designed to pressure the Apache into compliance. Captain Hayes had chosen his tactics well, avoiding direct confrontation while making it clear that he had the superior numbers and firepower. Woman Who Sees Far approached Sarah as she watched the soldiers from the edge of camp. The elderly woman spoke in a mixture of Apache and broken English, her meaning clear despite the language barriers. Sarah was being given a choice. She could return to the fort voluntarily, possibly preventing conflict between her new people and the soldiers, or she could stay and accept whatever consequences followed. I won't go back, Sarah said firmly, both to Woman Who Sees Far and to herself. I can't live that life anymore. The old woman nodded as if she had expected this answer. She placed a weathered hand on Sarah's shoulder and spoke again, this time managing the English words carefully. Then we fight. As darkness fell over the desert, Sarah realized that her decision to flee an unwanted marriage had evolved into something much larger and more significant. The Apache were preparing to risk their safety to protect her right to choose her own life. It was both humbling and terrifying to be at the center of such a momentous confrontation. Running Wolf found her as she sat by the fire, trying to process the magnitude of what was happening. Are you afraid? He asked, echoing his question from the day before. Yes, Sarah admitted, but not of dying. I'm afraid of being the cause of others' deaths. Fear can be wisdom, Running Wolf said, settling beside her. But do not forget that some things are worth fighting for. Your freedom is one of them. The right of my people to make our own choices about who we protect is another. Sarah looked into his face, illuminated by the dancing firelight, and saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. There was more than duty or principle in his decision to protect her. There was something personal, something that had grown between them in their brief acquaintance. Why are you really doing this? She asked softly. Running Wolf was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Because when I first saw you, I saw a spirit that belonged in the wild places, not locked away in buildings made by men who fear the open sky. And because I have come to care what happens to that spirit, Sarah felt her heart skip in a way that was entirely different from anything she had experienced with Captain Hayes. This wasn't the polite affection she had tried to cultivate for her intended husband, but something deeper and more honest. Before she could respond, a shout came from the edge of camp. The negotiations were about to begin, and Sarah's fate would be decided in the darkness of the desert night. A white flag appeared on the hill where Captain Hayes had positioned his command post, barely visible in the moonlight. Running Wolf stood and checked his weapons, though Sarah noticed he made no move to hide them. This would be a negotiation between equals, not a surrender. Stay close to the fire, Running Wolf told her. If shooting starts, get to the rocks behind woman who sees Far's dwelling. Ayana will show you. Sarah nodded, her mouth too dry to speak. Around the camp, Apache warriors were taking positions with the calm efficiency of people who had faced such situations before. Even the women and children seemed to know exactly what to do, moving to sheltered areas without panic or confusion. Running Wolf walked out into the open ground between the camp and the hills, accompanied by 2 older Apache men, whom Sarah recognized as respected leaders in the community. Their confidence was remarkable given that they were outnumbered at least 3-1 by well-armed cavalry soldiers. Captain Hayes rode down from his position with a small escort, stopping about 20 feet from the Apache delegation. Even at this distance, Sarah could see the rigid anger in his posture. This was a man whose authority had been challenged, and he would not rest until it was restored. "I've come to collect Miss Mitchell," Captain Hayes announced without preamble. "I'm prepared to overlook this incident if she's returned immediately and unharmed." "The woman came to us seeking protection," Running Wolf replied, his voice carrying clearly in the still desert air. "She has received it freely. She is not our prisoner to be returned." "She's obviously been coerced or threatened," Captain Hayes insisted. "No civilized woman would choose to live among savages unless her mind had been poisoned against her own people." Sarah felt anger flare at being discussed as if she had no will of her own. The assumption that her choice must be the result of coercion, rather than genuine preference, revealed everything about Captain Hayes' view of women and their capabilities. "Perhaps you should ask the woman herself what she chooses," Running Wolf suggested. "I don't negotiate with hostages," Captain Hayes snapped, "and I don't accept the word of someone who's clearly been influenced by hostile forces." The contempt in his voice was unmistakable, directed not just at Sarah but at the Apache people surrounding her. Sarah could see the tension increasing among the warriors, hands moving closer to weapons as the captain's words became increasingly insulting. Running Wolf maintained his calm demeanor, but Sarah could see the steel beneath it. "Captain Hayes, you have surrounded our camp with armed soldiers and made demands about a woman who has freely chosen to be here. If anyone is behaving like a hostile force, it is you." "I have my orders," Captain Hayes replied curtly. "Miss Mitchell is to be returned to proper authority. If you refuse to cooperate, I'm authorized to use whatever force is necessary. And if you attack peaceful people to kidnap a woman against her will, you will discover that we are also authorized to use whatever force is necessary to protect ourselves." The standoff had reached a critical point. Sarah could see soldiers on the hills shifting nervously, while Apache warriors tightened their grips on weapons. One wrong word or sudden movement could trigger a battle that would leave many people dead. Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. She stood up from beside the fire and walked toward the 2 groups of men. Behind her, she heard Woman Who Sees Far calling out in Apache, probably telling her to stay back, but Sarah continued walking until she stood beside Running Wolf. "Captain Hayes," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the desert, "I am here of my own free will. I was not coerced, threatened, or influenced by anyone except my own conscience. I refuse to marry you, and I refuse to return to the fort." Captain Hayes spurred his horse closer, his face twisted with rage. "You have no idea what you're saying. These people have filled your head with lies and romantic nonsense about noble savages. In a week, you'll be begging to come back to civilization. The only lies I've encountered recently were in your letters," Sarah replied. "You presented yourself as a thoughtful, open-minded man who respected different cultures. Instead, you're a bigot who sees anyone different from yourself as subhuman. How dare you?" Captain Hayes snarled. "I offered you marriage, protection, a respectable life. Instead, you choose to degrade yourself with these animals." The insult was too much for the Apache warriors to bear silently. Several of them stepped forward, weapons raised, and Sarah heard the distinctive sound of arrows being nocked and drawn. On the hills, soldiers were raising their rifles in response. "Enough," Running Wolf said, his voice cutting through the rising tension like a blade. He looked directly at Captain Hayes. "You have your answer. The woman stays by her own choice. Leave now, and there will be no blood spilled tonight." "This isn't over," Captain Hayes threatened. "I'll be back with enough men to burn this camp to the ground if necessary. Then you will find us ready," Running Wolf replied calmly. Captain Hayes wheeled his horse around and rode back toward his lines, his escorts following. Sarah watched him go, knowing that this confrontation had indeed settled nothing. If anything, it had made the situation more dangerous by confirming that neither side was willing to back down. As the soldiers began withdrawing from their positions around the camp, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and dread. The immediate crisis had passed, but Captain Hayes's parting threat had been quite real. He would return, probably with orders from higher command and enough force to overwhelm Apache resistance. "What happens now?" Sarah asked Running Wolf as they watched the last of the soldiers disappear into the darkness. "Now we prepare," he replied. "Captain Hayes will not give up easily. His pride has been wounded, and men like him cannot accept defeat. He will find a way to return with superior force." Woman who sees far approached them, speaking urgently in Apache. Running Wolf listened carefully, then nodded and replied in the same language. "My grandmother says the spirits have spoken to her again," he told Sarah. "She says a great change is coming, not just for you but for all our peoples. The old ways of living side by side are ending, and a new time of conflict is beginning." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night air. "What does that mean for us?" "It means we cannot stay here much longer. This camp is too exposed, too easy for soldiers to find and surround. We will have to move deeper into the mountains, to places where horses cannot easily follow." "And me? What happens to me?" Running Wolf turned to face her fully, his dark eyes serious in the firelight. "That depends on what you choose. Living with my people in the deep wilderness will be harder than anything you have experienced. There will be no comfort, no safety, no easy way back to the life you knew. If you have any doubts about your decision, now is the time to voice them." Sarah thought about the question seriously. She could ask to be taken somewhere safe, perhaps to a town where she could find work and start over. She could try to return to Boston and face whatever social consequences awaited her there. There were alternatives to both the life Captain Hayes offered and the uncertain future with the Apache. But as she looked around the camp at the people who had accepted her without question, who had been willing to fight for her right to choose her own path, Sarah knew her answer. "I choose to stay with you," she said firmly. "Whatever comes, whatever hardships we face, I want to face them as one of your people." Running Wolf smiled, and Sarah saw in his expression something that made her heart race. "Then you truly are no longer Sarah Mitchell from Boston. You are someone new, someone who belongs to the wild places and the free peoples." As the Apache began breaking camp in preparation for the move to safer territory, Sarah helped pack the few possessions she had acquired. The wooden bird that had started her journey toward freedom went carefully into her bundle, but she knew she no longer needed it as a symbol. She had learned to fly on her own. The last thing she saw as they prepared to leave was the distant lights of Fort Apache, where Captain Hayes was probably planning his next move. But Sarah felt no fear as she turned her back on that life forever. She was finally free, finally herself, and whatever challenges lay ahead in the wilderness, she would face them as a woman who had chosen her own destiny. Behind her, the fire that had warmed the Apache camp was carefully extinguished, leaving no trace of their presence except memories and the knowledge that sometimes the greatest courage comes from refusing to accept a life that would destroy your spirit. In the darkness of the desert night, Sarah Mitchell disappeared forever, and in her place walked a woman ready to embrace whatever future the wild lands might offer.